Hey, welcome back for video number 2 of chapter 1. Sam, I'm kind of curious. I'm wondering if you guys know how trees access the internet. They log in. Alright, that was just awkward for everybody, and I'm not even going to pretend to say that one was funny. So we're going to transition to something that is not awkward, and that is the death trap known as the Jamestown settlement. So, we talked about last time how the Europeans, as they became more interested in things like silk and gold and basically all these luxurious goods. And we also remember watching those videos on the lost colony of Roanoke. And again, one of the reasons they kind of supposedly hide what happens at Roanoke is they don't want to scare people away from the settlement of Jamestown. Now, Jamestown is founded by a joint stock company. And really what that term is going to refer to is you just have a bunch of rich individuals, a bunch of people who own companies. They're just going to form together and come with one single company, and they're going to send people over to this new colony known as Jamestown. And they are going to be people who are not necessarily wealthy. Most of the time they're second or third born sons, because the firstborn is going to be guaranteed the right to all the land that the father already owns. So a lot of them, honestly, they're kind of lazy and just say, hey, I'm just going to stick around here and not really have to work too often until father passes away. But the individuals that come here to Jamestown, they come with the idea that they are going to make a ton of money. They are going to become rich behind everyone's wildest dreams, and they mostly fail. And the reason they mostly fail is, think about yourself. If you're going on a camping trip, what are you going to need to bring with? Probably your number one answer is you need to bring water and you need to bring food. They did not bring either with. What they brought were chemicals. And the chemicals were there to test for gold. So you think you're going to this new land, this new territory, 3,000 miles away. You have just enough food to make it on that journey. You show up and you have chemicals to try to find gold. And that's going to be one reason. The other reason is it was kind of the first idea of socialism in the United States. And that was the idea that everyone's going to work, everyone's going to grow their own crops, everyone's going to share all the crops. And in your spare time, you go out and try to make money in gold. Now, the problem with that is everybody doesn't want to go and farm. Everybody wants to go and make money. So by the time more and more settlers come over, it was looked at as there's only 2 farms in the settlement of Jamestown. So that's one example. No, without the help of the Native Americans, without the help of the Powhatan Confederacy, the majority of the group would have died. But because they're able to make it past that first winter known as the starving time, and the reason I call it the death trap of Jamestown is only 500 people showed up. Out of those 500 people, there's only about 60 people that survived that first winter. It was, like I said, it was starving. People turned to cannibalism. It was a horrible, gross, and disgusting time period. And eventually they make it past that first winter because of the Powhatan Confederacy, and then they start to thrive a little bit more. And because they start to thrive a little bit more, there's all these new rules and regulations, and they create the House of Burgesses to pass these new laws. And the reason they have to have their own form of democracy, they can't just go and ask the king who's 3,000 miles away for approval on certain matters. So they come up with their own form of government known as the House of Burgesses. And once they start to profit, once they start to make money, the English crown, the English court, they are going to try to take over all of that territory. And they do that because the English court blames the company for a high death rate. And because there's a high death rate, they take away their royal charter, basically their signed piece of paper saying that they can have that land and have that territory. They take it away. The government now controls it. But it is going to be the first time that they are kind of sort of successful, and it starts to break off from there. The second one is we have Plymouth Colony. And unlike Jamestown, the people who went there were mostly going there for economic reasons. The settlement of Plymouth Colony was due to religious rights. Now, King James, he was prosecuting a group of separatists. And these individuals, they wanted to be free. They wanted to have their own form of religion. They were being, I guess you could say, they were being rebels. They were revolting against the government, and they were going to come over to the new territory, really with the option and the idea that they were going to have their own religion. Now, in 1620, these pilgrims, they headed for Virginia, but a storm was going to blow them off course. Really, their idea is they are going to try to land at Jamestown. But that storm really just messes everything up, and they're not going to be able to get to where they want to be at that point. So on the way, they draw up what they call the Mayflower Compact. And this is going to be kind of, in a way, the second variation of democracy in the United States. And really, what it does that's a little bit different is it puts a lot of the power back to the king. They're trying to say that they're doing this for God, they're doing this for the king, and they don't want to have the king try to send the redcoats to try to really just destroy them and then go to war with them. So they land there, and again, life is tough. They don't have no idea how to grow crops, but it was going to be a little bit more successful once they got more help from the Native Americans. And when more and more Puritans are going to be coming over, settling in new towns, we get some of these larger cities like Boston. They start to be drawn more into the Massachusetts region because there's a depression. They're starting to lose money in the wool industry. But the big thing that's a little bit different about Plymouth is the government and religion. They're going to be very, very closely intertwined, and they are going to be almost inseparable. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the diverse society as a whole. And the big reason that people want to get over to America is, I guess, first of all, there's little to no taxes, and second of all, you can have any job that you want to. You're not going to be forced into a job because that's what your father did, or that's what your parents wanted you to do. Yes, that was the case some of the time, but really, people have a lot of freedom. They have a lot of economic freedom. And the second thing is, once you had that freedom and little to low taxes, triangular trade is going to bring a ton of wealth to merchants, and they're going to start to build factories. They're going to start to make a ton of money off of it, and a lot of people are going to want to become more involved in it. And here the image on the right just kind of shows you how this triangular trade, how this route is going to be going on. You kind of see here it starts in America. Fish, whale, oil, lumber, tobacco goes to England. They then turn some of those goods into iron products, which then goes to the slave trade, which then goes back up to the United States. So, we kind of see that triangular flow there. But really what it does is it brings a hierarchy. It brings a class or a caste system, which is going to be good for the top. It's going to be good for the wealthy individuals, which they're going to be the ones controlling government, but it's really going to hurt the people who are on the lower end of the spectrum. So, as I said, merchants, the people who own the businesses, they're at the top. Below them is the artisans. They're the skilled workers, the blacksmiths, the gunsmiths, the people who own the shops. Below them is the lower class, who are going to be people who are more working in a factory. They're not really going to have the refined skills who are going to be artisans. And then below them we have indentured servants and enslaved Africans. Now, the difference between those two: indentured servants, they sign a contract to come over to the United States to work for a period of 3 to 7 years. After that time period, they can either sign another contract or they can become free. And today it's illegal. The 13th Amendment is going to outlaw this, but it did get a lot of people over to the United States. It did bring some wealth and prosperity for people. I'm thinking more specifically like Ben Franklin, probably the most famous, the most wealthy person in America at one point, was once an indentured servant to his older brother. And then enslaved Africans, they had really next to no rights, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that here on this slide, dealing more specifically with slavery. Now, we're not going to talk too much about this because in a lot of your other classes you've talked about slavery, and we'll talk about it more throughout the rest of the semester. But talking more specifically about the numbers, it's estimated that 10 to 12 million Africans were enslaved between 1450 and 1870. And as I just brought up, the 13th Amendment is going to outlaw slavery. It's also going to outlaw that indentured servitude, but it's going to be a really long time before there's going to be equal rights for everybody. And we kind of saw this. The colonies had to decide whether or not they wanted to have slavery, and in that game that we played at the beginning of class, but we can see just how many people were enslaved. And really, we also even hear this myth that there was no slavery in the North, it was only in the South. While that's true for some states like Massachusetts, who was the first to outlaw slavery, it was a very, very harsh reality that there was also slavery in the North. With gradual emancipation, it wasn't until like the 1850s or 1860s that there was no slavery in the North. But talking about some of the rights that they would have is the colonists, they passed things known as slave codes, which kept Africans captive. They did not allow African Americans to own property. They could not testify in court against whites. They could not receive education. That was sometimes allowed if it was the owner allowed it. They couldn't move about freely. They couldn't meet in a large group. Overall, it was a very rough and a very tough time period. Uprisings would take place periodically, but they weren't widespread. It wasn't widespread to the point where it was creating a civil war. We don't get that until the 1860s. But as I talked about some of the positives that America has done, and we've also done a lot of really negatives. And slavery and the treatment of Native Americans and treatment of minorities is definitely going to be at the top of that list. So I also think it's important that we start to talk a little bit more about some of the new ideas that were created by the British. Now, a lot of these new ideas that the British came up with, they were just flat out, they were dumb. It was like the king and all of Parliament, they were reading the same book called How to Lose Your Empire for Dummies. Because everything that they did and everything that they gave up, I think a lot of it could have been avoided with compromise, but they just wanted to make sure that they were in power. Anytime that the colonists protested, they gave in to the protest. It was just a bad time period for them. But we'll start with Charles II. When he takes the throne, he is determined to gain money from New England. And I think that's probably the first mistake that he has, is trying to make money from New England. Because once he starts this, it's basically just a domino effect of new law after new law and protest after protest. But he wants to try to make as much money as he possibly can from New England. And he does this really with two things right away. The first one is the Navigation Act. And what that does is every good going to and from the colonies had to be carried by British ships. Now, that means that, yes, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, they could trade with the colonies, but they had to take a detour. They had to go back up to England, and once they took that detour, they put it on British ships. British are then going to send it over to the colonies. But really, it's just like they create a middleman. And once that happens, the prices, they start to go up. And who's going to pay for those prices? It's going to be the colonists. So they start to rebel from this. Then they get to the Staple Act, require that all colonial imports to be from England. And I guess the issue I see is just so wrong with that is, if you can buy iron from Spain and it's going to be cheaper, why not buy it from them? And what they do is, now all of a sudden all the iron, all the steel, all the molasses that they're going to be buying has to be from England. And because England can't produce all of it, well, thinking about supply and demand, the price goes way, way up. And because of that, prices just continue to rise, and the colonists, they just get frustrated. And because of that, really, they're not going to follow the rules. They're not going to follow along with what the British are saying very early on. So many merchants, they just begin to smuggle in goods. You have a very, very famous individual like Sam Adams, who is going to be one of the most notorious smugglers of the time period. So they do that to kind of make more money. But Charles II, he doesn't last very long. And James II, once he takes over, he creates the Dominion of New England. And really just what a dominion is just he has partial control over it, just kind of showing that he has more power. But the biggest thing that happened was the Glorious Revolution. And this is, I don't know if you guys talked about it last year in world history, but this is basically the framework for the American Revolution. Now, we think oftentimes about the American Revolution as we started this mass movement of no taxation without representation and fighting for what you believe in. The truth is, that is stolen directly from the British citizens. And the reason that is stolen from them is their king was upsetting people in England, and what he was doing is he was disregarding Parliament, so he's disregarding these elected officials, which, I mean, they're technically they're elected, it's virtual representation, it's a huge issue, and they also is forcing them to practice Catholicism. So two things that people want to have, a say in their government, they want to have a say in their religion, and he is denying that for everybody. And then Parliament, to counteract that, they invite James's daughter, Mary, who is a Protestant, and her husband, William of Orange, to take the throne. So it's going to be, basically, they're inviting in individuals to overthrow the government. Here you have a coup d'etat, military takeover. But before they're able to accept the throne, they had to accept the English Bill of Rights, which are going to be kind of, in a way, an early constitution declaring who has what power, talking about democracy rights and things along those lines, which we kind of copy when we create our own constitution. But here's the big thing, and you can see it in all bold. I probably should have made the font larger, but it shows that a revolution is justified when individual rights are violated. So think about the American colonies. If we have to pay more money for goods because the British want to turn a profit and send everything on a British ship, do you think that is our rights being violated and being told in a capitalist society who we have to buy from? Whether you agree with it or not, the colonists, the majority of them, they think that their rights are violated. And because of that, they want to have a revolution. Now, the British are saying, no, you can't do this. We have a colony. We have charters. But here, they just did the exact same thing. So, really, in a way, the Glorious Revolution is good for the British because it sets up their own form of government and taking away power from the king. But it's also really, really bad for them because it also started the American Revolution.